Hey there, today I'm going to show you how I decorate this vanilla Skor cake. The first thing I do the night before is measure out all my ingredients. I leave the dry ingredients, oils, and butter out on the counter wrapped, and I pop the rest in the refrigerator. The first thing you'll see me do here is add the dry ingredients into the mixer and grab the paddle attachment. The butter on the counter there was softened a little bit more in the microwave. I do grab a dish towel to put over the top of the mixer because I did double the recipe. The dish towel helps to keep the flour in because it tends to overflow a tiny little bit as you move on. The next thing I do is add the butter in a little bit at a time. I don't think I show that on camera, but I just use a knife or a little palette knife to take a little bit of the butter at a time. You'll see me here taking the cooking spray, spraying the inside of all the pans, and then I add a little parchment circle inside of all the pans as well. In this next clip you can see how the flour is overflowing. It doesn't normally overflow this much, but today I think because I was using a smaller bowl on the mixer it was just a little bit much for it. But I'm adding the egg whites in here, and then after the egg whites I pop over to the buttermilk. I scrape down the sides a little bit and then I add more buttermilk in after that. After all the buttermilk is added, I scrape down the sides really well and add in the vanilla and oil. Mix that on high for 30 seconds and then scrape down the bowl really well again. Once the batter is all combined, I take it off the mixer and I get my pans ready. I use an ice cream scoop next to scoop even amounts into each cake pan. I find this just makes my cakes more uniform, and when you're doing a layered look they're not all a different size. The vanilla cake batter is pretty thick, so I use an offset palette knife to smooth out the tops of the cakes before I put them in the oven. This vanilla cake recipe doubled was able to give me 3 8-inch cake pans and 3 6-inch cake pans. I had 2 orders this week and they are both vanilla cakes, so it worked out pretty good. Next you'll see me popping them into the oven at 350 degrees. The time that it takes to bake my cakes varies depending on how many cakes I have in the oven. So I just bake the cakes until a toothpick comes out almost clean. If it comes out clean, I find it's a little bit dry. After the cakes cool, I move on to decorating. So you'll see here that I already have the buttercream ready to go. I put a little bit of buttercream on the cake board just to hold the first layer of cake down so it doesn't slide around on the board. I get these cake boards from a store called Bulk Barn. You can also get something similar at Michael's or probably Amazon. Putting generous amount of buttercream between each layer and using this offset spatula to smooth it out. You can get these spatulas online. Mine's pretty old, but you can get them on Amazon or you can get it at Michael's. So I'm not trying to be perfect with the buttercream. I'm trying to stack up the layers and put on what they call a crumb coat. So a crumb coat is just a thin layer around the outside of the cake to actually lock in the crumbs, and then when that is finished I will pop it in the fridge to harden up a little before I move on to the next layer. Sometimes where I like to make my cake so tall, I have to put a support beam down the middle. I didn't in this one I don't think, but if you put a support down the middle it doesn't slide back and forth as much and you don't have to worry about it slanting to one side. So next you'll see me using a bench scraper. You can get very similar ones to this online or at your local craft stores. So I'm using the bench scraper to make the buttercream a little bit thinner and just to make it as even as possible before popping it in the fridge. So here's the cake with the crumb coat. After this I add one more layer of buttercream and then I use my caramel sauce for a drip down the side. So I put the drip all the way around the cake and I try to alternate how long I squeeze the caramel on for, just so it's not so even. Next I'm adding buttercream rosettes to the top. I usually try to space them out back and forth around the cake so I don't have an odd number or a big space. So I'll just go back and forth until it's even. You can see how the caramel pools around the bottom of the cake board. You can leave it like that, you can scrape it off, or you can cover it over with some buttercream like I did. Next I add pieces of Skor bar around the top in between the rosettes. And lastly, I like to take Skor chips or Skor pieces and add those on the buttercream around the top and the bottom of the cake. So that's how I decorate my vanilla Skor cake. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. And I just want to say thanks for watching and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want to see any more of my videos.